It begins with silence. Not the playful silence that Johnny Carson mastered so well, the silence that made an audience lean in before he delivered a punchline. No, this is a heavier silence, the kind that returns decades later, uninvited. When we replay the past with clearer eyes, for more than 30 years, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was America's nightly escape, a polished ritual of laughter, glamour, and the comforting illusion that everyone who walked onto that stage was just there for harmless entertainment. But beneath the applause signs and the studio lights rested moments the nation has never fully reckoned with. These were the nights when racism wasn't just tolerated, it was rewarded with laughter. Nights when guests said things that today would end careers, trends, and reputations. Nights when America learned, not through textbooks but through pre-Matime television, that prejudice could be packaged as humor, softened by a smile, legitimized by a host who rarely challenged it. For some, it was a different time. For others, it was a painful reminder of a country that had not yet learned how to confront its own reflection. And when you revisit the old tapes, the grainy recordings, the nervous laughter, the performative confidence, you notice something that was easy to miss back then. These weren't isolated slips of the tongue. They were cultural signals. Signals that certain voices could say anything they wanted. Signals that certain groups would always remain the punchline. Signals that a stage as powerful as Carson's could normalize what should have been condemned. Which leaves us with the question Americans avoided for too long. Why did no one speak out? Maybe because the guests in those chairs were too influential to challenge. Maybe because the producers understood exactly what controversy did for ratings. Or maybe because the audience, both in the studio and across millions of living rooms, wasn't ready to admit that the country still carried a darkness that comedy couldn't mask. This story is not a nostalgic trip into late-night history. It is an excavation. An unsealing of the moments NBC never wanted replayed. The fragments of casual racism delivered with confidence, sometimes with charm, often with a sense of impunity. 7 guests in particular left behind exchanges that, when viewed today, feel like open wounds the entertainment industry tried to bandage with laughter. Each guest represents a different layer of America's unresolved tensions. Some spoke from arrogance, some from ignorance, some from genuine malice disguised as wit. And Carson, America's most beloved late-night diplomat, often responded with a chuckle, a deflection, or silence. Silence that echoed far louder than any joke. But before we reveal the names, before we dissect the uncomfortable truths each guest brought into Carson's studio, we must understand the power of the stage itself. This wasn't just a talk show. It was a cultural court. A nightly referendum on what America found acceptable. If someone spoke on Carson's couch, the nation listened. And that authority, unquestioned, unchallenged, unrivaled, makes the racist moments we're about to revisit far more than comedic missteps. They were endorsements. Not always intentional, but unmistakably real. And now, decades later, the question returns, heavier than ever. How did these moments happen? Why were they allowed to air without consequence? And what do they reveal about a country that preferred to laugh rather than confront its deepest truths? This is where the curtain lifts. This is where the truth finally takes its seat. To understand how 7 openly racist guests found their way onto the most influential talk show in American history, we must go back far before the tapings, before the studio lights, before Johnny Carson ever sat behind that desk. Their appearances weren't accidents. They were products of an era America pretended to outgrow but never fully confronted. Long before Carson became the king of late night, the entertainment industry was already shaped by a hierarchy that rewarded certain voices and silenced others. When television was young, it mirrored the country's unspoken rules. White performers were the storytellers. The commentators, the ones who could joke freely. Everyone else lived on the margins, invited only when their presence served a narrative that made the majority comfortable. America laughed at what reflected its own biases, and the studios, eager to chase that laughter, kept booking the same familiar faces. Carson, growing up in the heartland and rising through the ranks of radio and regional television, inherited this system. He didn't invent it, but he did inherit the power to enforce it, challenge it, or ignore it. And for most of his long reign, silence remained the safest choice. Silence kept the ratings high. Silence kept the sponsors happy. Silence made sure the show stayed within the boundaries the industry quietly set decades earlier. But the truth runs deeper. Many of the guests who would later become infamous for their racist remarks were already public figures shaped by a generation that normalized such behavior. Some were comedians who built their careers on punching down. Some were politicians whose influence rested on exploiting racial fears. Some were entertainers who believed fame gave them permission to say what others couldn't. And all of them were trained by a culture that taught them two things: their words mattered, and they would never be punished for them. Television in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s offered a stage without accountability. A guest could walk onto national television, look into a camera watched by millions, and express prejudices with full confidence that the moment would vanish after the broadcast. No internet to keep the clip alive. No social media backlash. No 24-hour outrage cycle. Just a room full of people laughing. A host pivoting to the next joke. And a country convincing itself that these things didn't really matter. But they did matter. Because every racist joke delivered on that stage did more than offend. It educated. It sent a message about what was acceptable, what was forgivable, what was normal. Children grew up hearing it. Adults repeated it. The media recycled it. And society absorbed it. This is the environment that shaped the 7 guests, whose moments now feel shocking in retrospect. They came from homes, communities, and industries where racism was not just tolerated, but woven into daily conversation. They were raised in a world that validated their prejudices and rewarded their boldness. So, when they walked onto Carson's set, they carried all of that history with them. And America, sitting at home on couches across every state, invited it into their living rooms night after night. Johnny Carson, with his quick wit and calm demeanor, learned early that his job wasn't to correct, alter, or confront the culture that shaped his guests. His job, at least as the networks defined it, was to entertain, to keep the machine running, to keep the nation laughing, and some at times laughter, even polite laughter, became a shield that protected the worst instincts of the people sitting beside Chaim. By the time these 7 guests appeared, the stage had already been built. The scaffolding was racism disguised as humor. The spotlight was a privilege few questioned. And the nation had spent decades normalizing a worldview that made their comments feel, to many viewers, almost ordinary. But they were not ordinary. They were warnings, disguised as jokes. And in the decades since, as America re-examines its past, these moments have transformed from forgotten laughs into haunting evidence. Before we revisit each guest's appearance, one truth must be acknowledged. They didn't bring racism into Carson's studio. It was already there, quiet, unspoken, embedded in the culture that built the show itself. All they did was expose it. The stage was ready for them long before the cameras rolled. And when they spoke, America finally heard what had always been hiding beneath the applause. By the time The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, reached the height of its power, it was no longer just a talk show. It was a cultural barometer, a nightly sermon delivered with charm, wit, and a desk that symbolized unchallenged authority. Celebrities, politicians, athletes, comedians, everyone wanted that seat, and they would do almost anything to keep it. Carson's show became the place where America tested its comfort level. If a joke landed on that stage, it became permissible. If a controversial guest was welcomed, it sent a message that their views, however flawed, belonged in the national conversation. For years, the formula worked. Audiences laughed. NBC prospered. Carson remained untouchable. But beneath the polished veneer, something was shifting. As the 70s edged into the 80s, America's racial tensions, thought by some to be buried, began resurfacing in unexpected places. Court cases, protests, presidential campaigns, comedy clubs, and increasingly, on television screens. The country was changing, but many of Carson's most notorious guests were not. They arrived on set, carrying beliefs older than the studio itself. They delivered lines with the confidence of people who'd never been told no. They wore big smiles, expensive suits, and a certainty that whatever they said would be forgiven, because it always had been. And for a long time, they were right. A racist joke delivered on Carson's stage often earned laughter, not outrage. A slur disguised as humor drew applause, not consequences. A stereotype tossed casually into the air lingered briefly before being swallowed by the commercial break. America watched, shrugged, and moved on. The industry saw no reason to change, but then came the moment when the mask cracked. It didn't happen all at once. It started quietly, in whispers. Young writers in Hollywood began questioning the old-style comedians. Civil rights leaders criticized the networks for rewarding bigotry with airtime. Black and brown performers, finally gaining visibility, refused to accept the idea that racism was entertainment. And in living rooms across the country, a new generation of viewers unwilling to laugh at their own dehumanization began to see these moments for what they were. Meanwhile, Carson himself was evolving. Though he remained cautious, even guarded, he began showing subtle discomfort when certain guests crossed lines. A tight smile, a shift in posture, a quick change of topic. It was never explicit, but it was there. A flicker of awareness that the country was no longer willing to let racism slide as effortlessly as it once had. The turning point arrived not through a single scandal, but through accumulated tension. Each controversial appearance left a faint scar. Each insensitive remark chipped away at the myth that the show existed in a harmless bubble. By the late 80s, it had become impossible to ignore that the world had changed, and the show, built on the blueprint of an older America, had not kept pace. Behind the scenes, NBC executives started reviewing tapes more carefully. Guest coordinators became more selective. Publicists warned their clients against going too far. But for the 7 guests whose appearances would become infamous, the damage had already been done. Their moments were preserved, not by digital archives, but by memory, by conversation, by late-night reruns and whispered stories of, "Did you see what he said that night?" Those 7 guests represented something larger than their own words. They were reminders of the era when being racist on national television wasn't a career-ending act. It was entertainment. They were echoes of a cultural norm America was desperately trying to outgrow, and they were proof that laughter can be just as harmful as silence. Carson's show remained beloved, but the innocence surrounding it had been shattered. The nation could no longer pretend that those moments were harmless relics of a bygone time. The turning point had arrived, subtle but irreversible. America began looking at its past, not with nostalgia, but with a new clarity that made the truth impossible to unsee. And that clarity is what leads us to the next chapter, the guests themselves, who they were, what they said, and why their words hit even harder today than they did the night the cameras rolled. For years, the unsettling moments lingered in the background of late-night history, half remembered, half forgotten, drifting through conversations like rumors no one wanted to confirm. But history, when pushed long enough into the shadows, eventually claws its way back into the light. And when America finally began examining its past with sharper eyes, the 7 guests who once blended seamlessly into Carson's show emerged as something far more disturbing. These weren't accidental offenders. They weren't comedians who slipped on a poorly delivered line. They were men whose careers, reputations, and public personas had been shaped by prejudice long before they stepped onto Carson's stage. Their racist remarks weren't improvisations. They were reflections of who they were, of the worlds they came from, and of a society that once applauded them. The reveal came slowly, triggered by a combination of academic research, archival projects, and the rising awareness that old television moments carried heavier weight than anyone realized. Young scholars started writing about late-night racism. Journalists began tracing the roots of problematic comedy. And, in the age of digital restoration, forgotten tapes resurfaced with the clarity of fresh wounds. Clip by clip, interview by interview, the truth took shape. One guest, a famous entertainer whose charm once captivated American audiences, delivered racial slurs on national television with a grin that suggested he thought the entire country agreed with Chaim. He treated racism like a party trick, punctuating his lines with smug confidence, expecting laughter and getting it. Another, a politician known for exploiting racial fear, used Carson's platform to repeat dog whistles so polished they passed as political commentary. The audience applauded without realizing they were applauding disguised hatred. A third, a comedian from an earlier era, leaned on caricatures and stereotypes as if they were the pillars of his identity. He spoke in exaggerated accents, mimicked entire communities, and acted as though his words carried no consequences. In that moment, they didn't. Then there was the actor whose bitterness ran so deep that even Carson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Every sentence he spoke was dipped in resentment, targeted at groups he believed were responsible for his declining career. It wasn't humor. It was a confession. Another was a cultural commentator who came with the intention of telling it like it is, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, that his version of truth was built on the foundation of bigotry. The final 2 guests were even more haunting. One was loved by millions, adored for his public persona, and praised for his wholesome eye image. Yet that image cracked when he mocked minorities with casual cruelty, as if he believed his icon status made him immune to criticism. The last guest, a performer whose career spanned decades, expressed racist ideas with such confidence that it became clear he never expected to be challenged. And he wasn't. Not by the audience, not by the network, not by Carson. That silence, the silence of a platform too powerful to fail and too comfortable to evolve, became the real scandal. As these clips resurfaced, America realized something uncomfortable. The show didn't just invite these guests, it amplified them, validated them, immortalized their words on a stage that millions trusted. The archive didn't merely expose the racist guests. It exposed the system that empowered them. The fall didn't come all at once. It arrived through conversations online, in classrooms, in living rooms where people re-watched old episodes with new eyes. Suddenly, those moments weren't funny anymore. They were alarming. They were painful, and they raised a question that hovered over Carson's legacy like a shadow stretching toward the present. Was he a bystander or a participant? The truth, as always, lies in the gray. Carson wasn't the villain, but he wasn't innocent either. He was a man of his team A that welcomed racism into its living rooms and called it entertainment. And as the truth finally surfaced, one thing became clear. The legacy of these 7 guests wasn't just about what they said, it was about what the world allowed them to say. Now, with the masks off and the past exposed, the story moves toward the unavoidable reckoning. What happened after the laughter stopped, when America realized those jokes were never harmless at all? When the 7 guests were finally dragged back into the public conversation, something unexpected happened. The world that once embraced them, laughed with them, and applauded their every word began to recoil. Not because people suddenly became more virtuous, but because hindsight has a way of transforming what once felt normal into something deeply unsettling. The laughter that once echoed through studios now felt like a ghostly reminder of a country that allowed too much to pass without question. And as America rewatched the tapes with new eyes, the consequences began to unfold across multiple layers of culture, media, and memory. The first wave of reckoning came from scholars and critics who built entire research fields around the politics of entertainment. They dissected the late-night era with surgical precision, exposing the structural biases that had gone unchallenged for decades. Academic papers began circulating, pointing out the normalization of racist tropes in pre-May television. College students watched Carson clips as case studies of how humor can reinforce inequality. Professors debated whether these moments represented individual failures or systemic indoctrination. For the first Team A, the 7 guests were not being judged as entertainers, but as cultural artifacts, evidence of how deeply racism had seeped into American entertainment. The second wave came from the digital restoration movement. Archivists digitized old tapes with remarkable clarity, which unintentionally revived moments that NBC likely preferred to keep buried. What once existed in the hazy glow of analog television now returned crisp and undeniable. The racist jokes no longer hid behind poor audio quality or grainy footage. They stood out like confessions, preserved in high definition. Social media amplified them instantly. A single 20-second clip could resurface and accumulate millions of views in hours. People who had never watched Carson a day in their lives learned about the 7 guests not through nostalgia, but through outrage. Then came the cultural backlash. Younger audiences, whose moral frameworks were shaped by modern standards, reacted with shock and anger. The idea that someone could casually express racist beliefs on national television and be rewarded for it felt incomprehensible. They questioned how such moments ever aired, why networks allowed it, and whether Carson had a responsibility to act. They confronted the uncomfortable truth that the entertainment industry had once served as a megaphone for prejudice. They demanded accountability, not from the aging stars who had once taken that stage, but from the institutions that shaped public consciousness. Meanwhile, older generations struggled with conflicting emotions. Some felt defensive, insisting that those were different times, arguing that critics were judging the past with moral tools that did not exist then. Others felt betrayed, realizing that the shows they grew up with contained messages they never recognized. What they once considered harmless comedy now looked like complicity. The more people rewatched the tapes, the clearer it became that these moments weren't just jokes, they were reflections of power, privilege, and a world that had never truly listened to the people it mocked. The guests themselves faced various outcomes. A few had already passed away, leaving their legacies at the mercy of posterity. Their families were forced to confront uncomfortable truths during interviews and biographies, caught between defending a loved one and acknowledging the harm their words caused. Some guests who were still alive responded with silence, refusing to address the resurfaced clips. Others doubled down, claiming that modern audiences were too sensitive, exposing the same defensiveness that had fueled their remarks decades earlier. And then there were those who issued carefully worded apologies, statements crafted more for damage control than remorse. But the public saw through it. An apology delivered half a century too late seldom felt sincere. Carson's legacy faced its own reckoning. For decades, he was viewed as the gold standard of American television, witty, polished, apolitical, universally beloved. But the context surrounding the 7 guests complicated that mythology. Critics argued that his neutrality, once seen as professionalism, often veered into complicity. He allowed racist remarks to pass without challenge, not because he endorsed them, but because he prioritized entertainment over ethics. Others defended him, pointing out that confronting powerful guests in that era would have been career suicide. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the uncomfortable gray. Carson did not encourage racism, but he did not stop it either. And sometimes silence can be as revealing as speech. NBC, too, was forced into the conversation. The network issued statements when old clips resurfaced, distancing itself from outdated content that does not reflect our values. But critics pushed further, asking why NBC chose to air these moments in the first place and whether the industry had learned anything. Each TMA, a viral post, resurfaced an old racist moment. NBC found itself dragged back into a debate about ethics, responsibility, and institutional memory. Yet the most profound consequences occurred not in boardrooms or academic circles, but in personal conversations. Families discussed racism with new complexity. Viewers questioned the entertainment they once consumed without thought. Some admitted they used to laugh at jokes they now found distasteful. Others realized they had internalized harmful beliefs without understanding where they came from. What began as an examination of 7 guests transformed into a national introspection, a mirror held up to a culture that had long blurred the line between humor and harm. The reckoning also reshaped how society understood comedy. It forced artists, writers, and performers to acknowledge that humor is never neutral. Every joke carries meaning. Every punchline draws a moral boundary. Late-night television, once the safest place for celebrities to speak freely, now carried an invisible weight, the awareness that the world was watching, judging, and refusing to excuse what once passed as entertainment. But perhaps the most significant consequence was this: America finally confronted the truth that racism does not disappear simply because society stops talking about it. It lingers in jokes, in traditions, in cultural habits, in the silences between conversations. The 7 guests were not anomalies. They were symptoms. Their resurfaced clips became evidence of a larger pattern, a reminder that the past has teeth, and it will bite if ignored long enough. And as the nation reckoned with these revelations, one final question began taking shape, looming over the story like a storm cloud that refused to pass. If this is what happened on the most trusted stage in America, what else have we overlooked? As the conversation around the 7 guests intensified, something larger began to surface, an understanding that the true wound left by these moments was not in the clips themselves, but in what they revealed about American culture. The resurfaced tapes did more than expose individual acts of racism. They exposed a society that had spent decades learning how to laugh at its own inequalities. If the 7 guests were the spark, the country's collective memory was the fuel, igniting a profound discussion about entertainment, power, and the invisible wounds that humor can inflict. For many viewers, the re-emergence of the clips felt like reopening an old injury they never fully acknowledged. Minority communities, who had spent generations being stereotyped and mocked on national television, saw the footage not as historical artifacts, but as reminders of everyday prejudices they endured. What white audiences once perceived as harmless jokes were, for them, coded insults, reinforcing the notion that they could be laughed at but never truly seen. These moments, broadcast into millions of homes, reinforced barriers rather than breaking them down. The realization that these tapes had been swallowed unquestioningly by past generations forced many to confront the role that everyday entertainment plays in shaping systemic prejudice. Families sat together, revisiting old episodes with a mixture of discomfort and disbelief. Children asked their parents why the audience laughed. Parents struggled to answer. Some admitted they never questioned the jokes because questioning would have meant confronting the uglier truths of the culture they belonged to. Others realized they had absorbed stereotypes as children, repeating them unconsciously, passing them along without understanding the origins. The 7 guests, once seen as harmless entertainers, had unknowingly helped build mental frameworks that shaped how millions viewed race, identity, and belonging. Critics argued that the true danger of those appearances was not the brazenness of the comments, but their simplicity. Racist ideas packaged as jokes appear non-threatening. They slip into conversations unnoticed. They normalize prejudice disguised as humor. Over time, those jokes harden into beliefs, beliefs into actions, and actions into systems. The 7 guests were the visible tip of a much deeper iceberg, a structure of bias built gradually through decades of casual acceptance. The tapes became evidence not only of what people once laughed at, but of what society once believed. In the entertainment industry, the resurfacing of the clips triggered a long overdue reckoning. Writers' rooms began re-examining the racial dynamics embedded in classic sitcoms and talk shows. Comedians debated whether certain comedic traditions deserved to be retired. Producers confronted the uncomfortable reality that the industry had shaped public opinion more profoundly than they were willing to admit. Suddenly, archives once treated as nostalgic relics were reclassified as cultural studies material, artifacts demanding analysis rather than admiration. This shift signaled a transformation in how America valued accountability in entertainment. Johnny Carson's legacy remained a delicate, complicated part of the discussion. He had been the face of late-night television for so long that his image seemed carved into the nation's collective memory. He was a symbol of comfort and consistency. But the resurfaced clips created a rift in that image. Some insisted that his responsibility had been limited by the norms of the time, that expecting him to challenge guests on live television was unrealistic. Others argued that his silence was precisely the problem, that silence from someone with such immense influence allowed racism to flourish unchallenged. Those debates did not diminish Carson's brilliance, but they brought balance to his legacy. For the first time, he was viewed not only as a cultural icon, but as a participant in a flawed system. The myth softened. giving way to a human portrait filled with nuances. The guests themselves became symbols of an era, figures caught at the intersection of personal prejudice and a culture willing to indulge them. Some had their reputations permanently scarred by the resurfaced clips. Others found unexpected support from parts of society unwilling to let go of outdated beliefs. Their legacies bifurcated, one for the fans who remembered the humor, another for the critics who remembered the harm. They turned into cautionary tales, reminders that fame does not shield a person from the consequences of their words. Beyond the entertainment industry, the resurfaced tapes influenced conversations about politics, education, and social identity. Activists pointed to them as proof that racism had long been embedded in the country's entertainment and media structures. Teachers used them as tools to explain implicit bias. Lawmakers referenced them in debates about hate speech and media accountability. What had begun as a discussion about 7 guests expanded into a national examination of cultural power and responsibility. Even more striking was the emotional fallout. People who once laughed at the jokes now felt unsettled by their own reaction. Some apologized publicly. Others privately wrestled with self-reflection. The clips forced a confrontation, not with the past itself, but with the viewer's past self, who they were, what they accepted, and what they failed to question. The 7 guests became mirrors, revealing not only the prejudices of the people on stage, but the blind spots of the audience who cheered them on. In this way, the tapes carried a psychological weight far heavier than their duration suggested. Over time, the discourse began to shift from blame toward understanding how culture shapes perception, how humor can camouflage harm, how silence can validate wrongdoing. People acknowledged that the 7 guests were products of an era that rewarded their behavior, but they also recognized that society had evolved. And with that evolution came the responsibility to confront the past honestly. Despite everything, one truth remained. The legacy of those moments refused to fade. Not because people wanted to cling to the controversy, but because the conversation had become larger than the clips themselves. It had become a dialogue about the country's relationship with race, entertainment, and truth. The 7 guests were no longer just names or faces. They were symbols in an ongoing cultural negotiation. And through this negotiation, America discovered that the past does not disappear simply by being ignored. It lingers until acknowledged, waits until examined, and resurfaces until understood. The resurfaced tapes were not ghosts haunting the present. They were signals demanding attention. They asserted that progress is not the absence of prejudice, but the willingness to confront it. As the reckoning deepened, another question rose from the shadows, one that would shape the final chapter of this story. If revisiting the past exposes wounds, can it also inspire healing? And what does healing look like in a world where the line between humor and harm has forever been redrawn? In the end, the story of the 7 racist guests who sat across from Johnny Carson is not really about them. It is not even about Carson. It is about a nation learning, slowly and painfully, and that the past it laughed at was the same past that carved invisible wounds into generations who had no choice but to endure the jokes. When the resurfaced clips ignited debate, people initially treated them as isolated curiosities, fragments of an outdated world, with no power to shape the present. But as the conversation deepened, America realized those moments were not relics at all. They were threads woven into the fabric of the culture, threads that still affected lives, beliefs, and relationships. The resurfacing of the tapes marked the beginning of an uncomfortable journey toward self-recognition, America prides itself on its ability to reinvent, to shed its mistakes, to declare itself reborn with every new decade. Yet reinvention requires honesty, and honesty requires facing truths long buried beneath nostalgia. The 7 guests forced that confrontation. They pushed the country to acknowledge that entertainment has always been more than entertainment. It has been a teacher, a mirror, a sculptor of societal values, and like any powerful tool, it can harm as easily as it can heal. Communities who had once seen themselves reduced to stereotypes on national television found themselves newly empowered by the public discourse. They spoke openly about what it felt like to grow up watching shows that treated them as punchlines. They explained how casual mockery shaped their self-image, how the laughter they heard in the background of those episodes echoed in real-life interactions with teachers, employers, neighbors, and strangers. Their testimonies revealed something stark, that racism delivered as humor often sinks deeper than hatred expressed outright. Because jokes slip beneath the guard of critical thought. People do not analyze what they laugh at, they absorb it. This revelation forced America to grapple with the idea that harm is not always loud. So many times it is quiet, disguised, wrapped in applause. Sometimes it hides behind a host's charming smile, or a polished punchline crafted for broad appeal. And sometimes it is so deeply ingrained in the culture that no one notices until decades later. When clarity finally pierces the fog of nostalgia, the reckoning also influenced the next generation of entertainers. Young comedians began questioning the ethics of their craft. Writers challenged the tradition of punching down. Late-night hosts publicly addressed the mistakes of their predecessors, acknowledging that the world they inherited was shaped by humor that often perpetuated inequality. These conversations, once unthinkable on national television, became part of the new norm. Comedy, once treated as an untouchable sanctuary, free from moral scrutiny, was finally recognized as an art form with responsibility. Meanwhile, as America re-examined the late-night era, questions about Carson's role lingered in a fog of ambiguity. He was neither villain nor hero, neither champion of justice nor architect of harm. He was a man bound by the expectations of his era, navigating a narrow path carved by network executives, cultural norms, and the invisible pressure to maintain ratings. The truth of his involvement lies not in what he said, but in what he did not say. Silence is rarely neutral. Silence can soothe an audience, protect a guest, or reinforce a prejudice. In Carson's case, it did all three. But acknowledging this does not diminish his talent or his legacy. It simply humanizes him. The 7 guests, however, remain fixed in their roles as symbols of a time when racism could sit under studio lights without consequence. Their stories, once dismissed as old clips, evolved into lessons that stretched far beyond entertainment. They became reminders that prejudice thrives not only in anger, but in complacency, not only in cruelty, but in comfort. The lesson they left behind was simple yet profound. What a society chooses to laugh at reveals far more than what it chooses to condemn. As the public discussion matured, a new question emerged, one that pointed not backward but forward. What now? What should America do with this knowledge? How should a nation respond when its cultural history exposes its moral blind spots? Some argued for erasing the clips entirely. Others insisted they should remain accessible as warnings. Scholars suggested using them as educational tools. Activists demanded accountability from networks that had profited from prejudice. Families debated how to teach children about the line between humor and harm. Every answer carried weight, but none offered a perfect solution. Because the truth is that the past cannot be rewritten, it can only be understood. And understanding requires consistent reflection. It requires acknowledging that progress is not measured by how much society forgets, but by how much it is willing to remember. The 7 guests must be remembered, not as villains, not as curiosities, but as evidence of the cultural structures that allowed their words to flourish. Forgetting them would mean forgetting the conditions that shaped them. Remembering them means ensuring that those conditions are never repeated. The country slowly realized that healing does not come from burying uncomfortable truths. Healing comes from creating space for them. The resurfaced tapes created that space. They forced conversations across dinner tables, in classrooms, in newsrooms, in studios where comedians now write with a heightened awareness of the world around them. They encouraged introspection, humility, and most importantly, growth. And yet, even after all the debates, analyses, and reflections, one final truth remains. The legacy of those moments endures not because they were shocking, but because they reveal something essential about how societies evolve. Change does not happen cleanly. It does not arrive fully formed. It unfolds through tension, discomfort, confrontation, and reflection. The 7 guests and the stage that welcomed them were part of that evolution. They exposed the cracks in the culture. They made the country look at itself honestly, and in that honesty lies the path forward. The past has been unmasked, the laughter examined, the silence understood, the wound acknowledged, the lesson uncovered. Now the question becomes whether America will allow this understanding to reshape the future, or whether it will return, once again, to the comfort of forgetting.